Welcome to a story that begins with an impossible promise and ends with the largest country on Earth vanishing overnight. On December 25, 1991, a red flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time, and a state that had stretched across 11 time zones, commanded the second most powerful military on the planet, and sent the first human being into outer space simply ceased to exist. How does a superpower disappear? And how did it rise in the first place from the wreckage of a feudal empire, where tens of millions of serfs had only been freed a single generation before the first revolutionaries began plotting in basement rooms across St. Petersburg? This is the complete history of the Soviet Union, and we will tell it from beginning to end. Not starting in 1917, but reaching back into the deep contradictions of Imperial Russia, a vast dominion ruled by the Romanov dynasty for 3 centuries, where golden palace halls stood only miles from villages trapped in medieval poverty. We will follow every step of this extraordinary arc: the revolutionary fire that toppled a Tsar, the brutal civil war between Reds and Whites that killed millions, the formal birth of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics on December 30th, 1922. Stalin's iron grip, his 5-year plans that built cities from empty steppe, and his purges that devoured the very people who had made the revolution. We will walk through the unimaginable devastation of the Great Patriotic War, where 27 million Soviet citizens perished defeating Nazi Germany. We will witness the launch of Sputnik, hear the voice of Yuri Gagarin from orbit, and stand at the edge of nuclear annihilation during the Cuban Missile Crisis. We will explore how ordinary people actually lived behind the Iron Curtain, in communal apartments and factory towns, in bread queues and pioneer camps, in a world where free education and universal health care existed alongside censorship, fear, and chronic shortage. And we will follow the final chapters, Gorbachev's reforms that intended to save the system, but instead unleashed the forces that tore it apart, until 15 new nations emerged from the wreckage, carrying Soviet borders, Soviet memories, and Soviet contradictions into an uncertain future. This story matters because the Soviet experiment did not end when the flag came down. Its legacy shapes the world you live in right now. The borders drawn by Soviet mapmakers became the front lines of 21st century conflicts. The nuclear arsenals assembled during the Cold War still define the global balance of power. And the fundamental question the Soviet Union posed, whether radical equality can be built by the power of the state, remains one of the most urgent and unresolved debates in human history. If you find meaning in complete journeys through the rise and fall of the powers that shaped our world, please subscribe to this channel so you never miss an exploration. Each week, we bring you the full story of a civilization, an empire, or a union that changed the course of history. Now let us step back to the final decades of the 19th century, to a vast empire of contradictions stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean, and let us begin. Snow settles on the granite embankments of St. Petersburg, a city raised from marshland by imperial decree, its baroque facades and gilded spires reflecting the ambitions of a dynasty that has ruled for 3 centuries. The Winter Palace stretches along the Neva River, its 1,000 rooms housing the court of the Romanovs, an autocracy that governs 1/6 of the Earth's land surface. From the Baltic coast to the Pacific shore, from the Arctic tundra to the deserts of Central Asia, this empire encompasses more than 100 nationalities, dozens of languages, and a population that by the late 19th century exceeds 120 million souls. It is the largest contiguous state on the planet, and it is fracturing from within. For generations, the foundation of Russian society rested on serfdom, a system binding tens of millions of peasants to the land and to the will of their landlords. When Alexander II signed the Emancipation Manifesto in 1861, he freed the serfs in law, but left them shackled in practice. The former serfs received land, but they owed redemption payments stretching decades into the future. Village communes controlled their movement. Poverty remained absolute. Along the Volga, in the Black Earth provinces of the south, in the birch forests of the north, peasant families lived in wooden huts with earthen floors, their lives governed by the rhythm of harvest and hunger. Alexander's great reforms touched the judiciary, local government, and the military, yet they stopped short of limiting autocratic power. His reward was assassination by revolutionary bomb in 1881. His son, Alexander III, responded with ferocious counter-reforms, tightening censorship, restricting universities, persecuting religious minorities, and reinforcing the secret police. The message was unmistakable. Reform invited chaos, and only the iron hand of the Tsar could hold the empire together. Yet beneath this enforced stillness, Russia was changing. In the 1880s and 90s, Finance Minister Sergei Witte drove a program of state-directed industrialization. Foreign capital, primarily French and Belgian, poured into railways, mines, and textile mills. The Trans-Siberian Railway, begun in 1891, stretched eastward across 5,000 miles of forest and steppe, a feat of engineering that bound Vladivostok to Moscow. Factory districts mushroomed around St. Petersburg and Moscow, drawing peasants into cramped tenements where 12-hour shifts, dangerous machinery, and starvation wages defined existence. By 1900, Russia ranked among the world's largest industrial producers, yet this modernity existed as an island surrounded by an ocean of agrarian backwardness. In the smoke-filled rooms of exile and underground circles, new ideas took root. Marxist study groups formed in the universities and factory floors. In 1898, 9 delegates gathered secretly in Minsk to found the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, a moment so modest it seemed insignificant. But the ideas they carried, the conviction that history moved through class struggle toward inevitable revolution, would prove more explosive than any bomb. Alongside them, socialist revolutionaries organized among the peasantry, and Narodnik traditions of populist rebellion persisted in the countryside. The empire's social architecture resembled a building constructed without mortar. At the summit stood the Tsar, the Orthodox Church, and a tiny aristocratic elite. Below them, a thin layer of merchants, professionals, and industrialists, and beneath all, the vast mass of peasants and the growing ranks of industrial workers, bound together only by shared deprivation. The contradictions were structural and deepening. A medieval political system presided over a modernizing economy. An autocrat who claimed divine authority ruled subjects who increasingly demanded representation. A multinational empire suppressed the languages and aspirations of Poles, Finns, Ukrainians, Georgians, and dozens of other peoples. The century turns. Nicholas II sits on the throne, a man of gentle temperament and rigid conviction, devoted to autocracy as a sacred inheritance. He cannot see what is coming. The empire gleams on the surface, its palaces radiant, its armies vast, its railways extending ever farther into the wilderness. But the foundations are hollow, and the weight above grows heavier with each passing year. The first crack comes not from within the empire's borders, but from the distant waters of the Pacific. In February 1904, Japan strikes the Russian fleet at Port Arthur, and the war that follows exposes every weakness the autocracy has concealed. Russian warships sail halfway around the globe, only to be annihilated at Tsushima in May 1905. The humiliation is total. A European empire, vast and ancient, defeated by an Asian nation the court had dismissed with casual contempt. The shock reverberates through every layer of Russian society. On a frozen Sunday morning, January 22, 1905, a vast procession of workers moves through the streets of St. Petersburg toward the Winter Palace. They carry icons and portraits of the Tsar. They are led by Father Garpon, a priest who believes the sovereign will hear their plea for fair wages, shorter hours, and basic dignity. The crowd numbers perhaps 140,000. They do not carry weapons, they carry petitions. At the palace gates, soldiers open fire. Cavalry charges into the fleeing masses. By nightfall, hundreds lie dead or wounded on the snow-covered squares. Bloody Sunday shatters the myth of the benevolent Tsar. Across the empire, strikes erupt in factories, mutinies spread through military garrisons, and peasants burn manor houses in the countryside. The battleship Potemkin's crew revolts in the Black Sea. Barricades rise in Moscow's Presnya district, where workers hold out for days against artillery. Nicholas yields. The October Manifesto of 1905 promises civil liberties and an elected legislature, the State Duma. But the concession is tactical, not sincere. The first two Dumas are dissolved when they prove too independent. Prime Minister Pyotr Stolypin attempts agrarian reform, creating a class of prosperous peasant landowners to stabilize the countryside, while simultaneously hanging so many revolutionaries that the noose earns the name Stolypin's necktie. His assassination in 1911 removes the last statesman capable of reform from above. Meanwhile, the revolutionary underground deepens. The Russian Social Democratic Labour Party has already split at its 1903 Congress into two factions. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin from exile, demand a tight conspiratorial party of professional revolutionaries. The Mensheviks favor a broader movement. Both operate through underground cells, smuggled newspapers, and coded correspondence, hunted by the Okhrana secret police, yet never fully suppressed. Then comes the catastrophe that dwarfs all others. In August 1914, Russia enters the Great War. Initial advances into East Prussia end in the devastating encirclement at Tannenberg. The front stretches from the Baltic to Romania, consuming men and material at a rate the empire cannot sustain. By 1915, the Great Retreat costs Russia vast territories, millions of casualties, and what remains of public confidence. Factories produce shells, but not enough. Railways carry troops forward and wounded backward in endless grinding cycles. The Tsar assumes personal command of the armies in September 1915, tying his prestige directly to every defeat. At court, the Empress falls under the influence of Grigory Rasputin, a Siberian mystic whose apparent ability to ease the hemophilia of the air becomes political leverage. Ministers are appointed and dismissed at his suggestion. The aristocracy is appalled. Rasputin's murder in December 1916 changes nothing. Petrograd, in the winter of 1917, is a city of bread queues stretching around frozen blocks, of women standing for hours in temperatures far below freezing, of soldiers garrisoned in barracks who no longer believe in the war. On February 23rd, International Women's Day, textile workers in the Vyborg district walk off their shifts. Within days, the strike becomes general. Soldiers of the Petrograd garrison refuse orders to fire on crowds, then join them. The Duma forms a provisional committee. The Petrograd Soviet of Workers and Soldiers Deputies reconstitutes itself. On March 2, 1917, Tsar Nicholas II, isolated in his railway car at Pskov, signs the instrument of abdication. 3 centuries of Romanov rule end not with a grand battle, but with a telegram and a signature, while outside the snow continues to fall on an empire that has ceased to exist. The empire that ceased to exist leaves behind 2 rival claimants to its future. The provisional government, led first by Prince Lvov and then by Alexander Kerensky, occupies the formal ministries along the Neva. The Petrograd Soviet, a sprawling assembly of workers and soldiers, holds the real power of the streets. This arrangement, known as dual power, is unstable from its first hour. The war continues, the factories remain hungry, the land question festers unanswered. Into this volatile spring arrives a single man aboard a sealed railway car. On April 3, 1917, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin steps onto the platform of the Finland station in Petrograd, greeted by crowds and an armored car draped in red. He has crossed wartime Germany with the tacit permission of the Kaiser's government, which calculates that revolution in Russia serves German interests. Lenin wastes no time. The following day he presents his April theses, demanding no support for the provisional government, an immediate end to the war, transfer of all power to the Soviets, and nationalization of land. Even many Bolsheviks are stunned by the radicalism. Through the spring and summer, Petrograd seethes. Soldiers desert the front in tens of thousands. In July, armed workers and soldiers surge into the streets demanding the Soviet take power, but the movement is premature and disorganized. The July days end in repression. Lenin flees to Finland. Trotsky is arrested. The Bolsheviks appear broken. Then Kerensky overplays his hand. In late August, General Lavr Kornilov marches troops toward Petrograd, intending to crush the Soviet and impose military order. Kerensky, desperate, turns to the very Bolsheviks he has been persecuting, arming Red Guards and releasing imprisoned leaders to help defend the capital. The Kornilov affair collapses without a battle, but the damage is done. Kerensky is discredited. The Bolsheviks emerge as defenders of the revolution, and through September their membership in the Soviets surges. Lenin, still hiding across the border, sends letter after letter demanding insurrection. By October, he returned secretly to Petrograd. On the 10th of October, in a cramped apartment on the city's outskirts, the Bolshevik Central Committee votes 10-2 in favor of armed uprising. Leon Trotsky, now chairman of the Petrograd Soviet, organizes the Military Revolutionary Committee to coordinate the seizure. The Smolny Institute, a former finishing school for noble girls, becomes the nerve center. Couriers move through its corridors carrying orders to Red Guard units, to sympathetic garrison regiments, to sailors of the Baltic Fleet at Kronstadt. On the night of October 24th, armed detachments begin occupying bridges, telegraph offices, railway stations, and the state bank. There is remarkably little resistance. The provisional government, isolated in the Winter Palace, commands almost no loyal troops. On the evening of October 25th, a blank shot from the cruiser Aurora signals the final advance. Red Guards and soldiers enter the Winter Palace through servant entrances and unguarded corridors. The ministers of the provisional government are arrested in a small dining room. Kerensky has already fled the city in a borrowed automobile. That same night, at the Smolny, the Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets convenes. Mensheviks and moderate socialist revolutionaries walk out in protest. Lenin, appearing before the remaining delegates, announces that the provisional government has fallen. Within hours, the Congress passes the decree on peace, calling for immediate negotiations to end the war without annexations, and the decree on land, abolishing private ownership of land and transferring it to peasant committees. A new government, the Council of People's Commissars, is formed with Lenin as chairman. The seizure of power in Petrograd takes fewer than 48 hours and costs fewer than a dozen lives. But the consequences are limitless. In January 1918, the freely elected Constituent Assembly meets for a single day before Bolshevik guards dissolve it, ending Russia's brief experiment with parliamentary democracy. On March 3, 1918, Soviet Russia signs the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany, surrendering vast territories including Ukraine, the Baltic lands, and Finland in exchange for peace. The cost is staggering, but Lenin insists the revolution must survive at any price. The most radical government in modern history now holds power in the world's largest country, and the forces gathering against it are already sharpening their swords. The swords come from every direction. By the spring of 1918, the Bolshevik government controls little more than the old Muscovite heartland, a shrinking island surrounded by enemies. From the south, General Anton Denikin assembles the volunteer army among the Cossack lands of the Don and Kuban. From the east, Admiral Alexander Kolchak declares himself supreme ruler of Russia in Omsk, commanding forces stretched across Siberia. From the northwest, General Nikolai Yudenich threatens Petrograd itself. These white armies share a hatred of Bolshevism, but agree on almost nothing else. Monarchists alongside republicans, liberals beside reactionaries, their disunity a fatal weakness that mirrors the fractures of the old empire they claim to restore. Foreign powers feed the chaos. British troops land at Murmansk and Archangel. Japanese forces occupy Vladivostok. French warships anchor in the Black Sea. American soldiers patrol the Trans-Siberian Railway. 14 nations in total intervene, not with enough force to overthrow the Bolsheviks, but with enough to deepen the bloodshed and harden revolutionary resolve. Leon Trotsky, appointed People's Commissar of War, performs an act of organizational genius. From nothing he forges the Red Army, conscripting former Tsarist officers under the watch of political commissars, imposing iron discipline with the threat of execution for desertion. His armored train becomes legendary, racing across thousands of miles of front line, delivering speeches, ammunition, and summary justice in equal measure. By the autumn of 1918, the Red Army numbers over 1 million soldiers. On the night of July 17, 1918, in the basement of the Ipatiev House in Yekaterinburg, Bolshevik guards execute Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, their 5 children, and 4 household servants. The killing eliminates any possibility of monarchist restoration around a living symbol. The Romanov dynasty, which ruled for 3 centuries, ends in a cellar with revolver smoke and bayonet wounds. The policy called war communism transforms the home front into a second battlefield. The state nationalizes all industry, abolishes private trade, and sends armed requisition detachments into the countryside to seize grain from peasants at gunpoint. Villages that resist are burned. The grain feeds the Red Army and the starving cities, but it devastates agriculture. Famine spreads across the Volga region, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan. Typhus follows hunger, carried by lice through overcrowded trains and refugee columns. Hospitals overflow with the dying. Through 1919 and 20, the tide turns. Kolchak's Siberian offensive collapses, and he is captured and shot in Irkutsk in February 1920. Denikin advances to within 200 miles of Moscow before his supply lines break and his army disintegrates. Wrangel holds Crimea until November 1920, when Red forces storm the Perekop Isthmus and the last white evacuees sail for Constantinople. The Polish-Soviet War of 1920 brings a different kind of defeat. Bolshevik armies under Mikhail Tukhachevsky drive westward toward Warsaw, dreaming of carrying revolution into Europe. But the Polish counterattack at the Vistula in August shatters the advance. The Treaty of Riga in March 1921 draws a border that leaves millions of Ukrainians and Belarusians under Polish rule. Even victory brings rebellion. In March 1921, sailors at the Kronstadt naval fortress, once celebrated as heroes of the revolution, rise against Bolshevik authoritarianism, demanding free Soviets and an end to one-party dictatorship. Red Army troops cross the ice of the Gulf of Finland and crush the uprising in 10 days of bitter fighting. In Tambov province, peasant insurgents wage guerrilla war against grain requisitions until the Red Army deploys poison gas and mass hostage-taking to suppress them. The civil war ends not with a single surrender, but with exhaustion. By 1921, the Russian economy has collapsed to a fraction of its pre-war output. Industrial production stands at barely a fifth of 1913 levels. The population of Petrograd has fallen from 2.5 million to 700,000 as residents flee starvation. Across the former empire, an estimated 7 to 12 million people have perished from combat, famine, typhus, and terror, both red and white. The Bolsheviks have survived, but they govern a wasteland, and the methods of survival have become the methods of rule. From the wreckage, Lenin retreats. In March 1921, at the 10th Party Congress, he announces the new economic policy, a dramatic reversal that replaces forced grain requisitions with a fixed tax in kind, allowing peasants to sell their surplus on the open market. Small-scale private trade and manufacturing return almost overnight. Along the Arbat and in the market squares of Moscow, traders reappear behind wooden stalls heaped with bread, sunflower oil, leather boots, and tobacco. Private restaurants open their doors. Small workshops resume production. The state retains control of what Lenin calls the commanding heights: heavy industry, banking, foreign trade, and railways, but beneath that canopy, a semi-free market breathes life back into a shattered economy. By 1923, agricultural output begins climbing toward pre-war levels, and a new class of small entrepreneurs, derisively nicknamed NEP men, accumulates modest wealth in the interstices of socialist planning. Yet even as markets revive, the political architecture hardens. The 10th Congress simultaneously bans all factions within the Communist Party, eliminating organized internal dissent at the very moment economic liberalization begins. The one-party state crystallizes. The Cheka is reorganized into the state political directorate, but its surveillance apparatus remains intact. Censorship tightens around publishing, theater, and the press. The paradox of the new economic policy era is visible on any Moscow street. A private shopkeeper selling herring beside a wall plastered with propaganda posters demanding collective discipline. The nationalities question demands resolution. Across the former empire, Bolshevik power has been reimposed by force in Ukraine, the Caucasus, and Central Asia, but the legal relationship between these territories remains undefined. Stalin, serving as People's Commissar of Nationalities, proposes absorbing the non-Russian republics into the Russian Federation as autonomous regions. Lenin, increasingly alarmed by what he calls Great Russian chauvinism, rejects this plan and insists on a voluntary union of formally equal republics. On December 30th, 1922, delegates gather in the Bolshoi Theatre in Moscow to ratify the Treaty of Creation. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics comes into existence, binding 4 founding members: the Russian Federation, the Ukrainian Soviet Republic, the Belarusian Soviet Republic, and the Transcaucasian Federation encompassing Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. A new constitution adopted in January 1924 establishes a bicameral legislature and a formal right of secession that exists only on paper. Behind the ceremonial architecture, Lenin is dying. A series of strokes beginning in May 1922 progressively robs him of speech and movement. From his sickbed at the Gorky estate outside Moscow, he dictates notes that will become known as his testament, a remarkable document warning the party that Stalin has concentrated immeasurable power in his hands and may not use it with sufficient caution. He recommends Stalin's removal as General Secretary. He criticizes Trotsky for excessive self-confidence. He evaluates Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Bukharin with surgical precision. The document reaches only a handful of senior leaders and is suppressed after his death. On January 21, 1924, Lenin dies at the age of 53. His body is embalmed against his family's wishes and placed in a wooden mausoleum on Red Square, later replaced by the granite and porphyry structure that still stands. The cult of Lenin begins immediately. Cities renamed, statues erected, his writings canonized as sacred text. Petrograd becomes Leningrad. The succession struggle unfolds through committee rooms and Congress halls. Stalin, controlling party appointments as General Secretary, methodically builds a network of loyal officials across every province. He allies first with Zinoviev and Kamenev against Trotsky, then turns against them alongside Bukharin, then prepares to discard Bukharin as well. Trotsky, brilliant but politically isolated, is stripped of his military posts by 1925. By 1927, he is expelled from the party. By 1929, he is exiled from the Soviet Union entirely. Each defeated rival vanishes from photographs, erased from the official record, as though they had never stood beside Lenin at all. The union born in the Bolshoi Theatre now belongs to a single will. That single will now reshapes an entire civilization. By 1928, Joseph Stalin stands unchallenged at the summit of Soviet power, and the doctrine he has championed since the mid-20s, socialism in one country, becomes the ideological engine driving every decision. Where Trotsky argued that revolution must spread internationally or perish, Stalin insists the Soviet Union can and must build socialism within its own borders, transforming a backward agrarian nation into an industrial fortress through sheer collective effort and state direction. It is a doctrine of national ambition wrapped in Marxist language, and it resonates with a party apparatus exhausted by years of waiting for world revolution that never arrives. The new economic policy, Lenin's pragmatic retreat into partial capitalism, has served its purpose. Markets have restored basic food supplies, small traders have revived urban commerce, and the economy has clawed back to pre-war levels. But the NEP has also produced uncomfortable contradictions: prosperous private merchants called nepmen, wealthy peasants labeled kulaks, and a growing sense within the party that socialism is being built too slowly, if at all. Stalin seizes this anxiety. At the 15th Party Congress in December 1927, the delegates endorse the principle of accelerated industrialization and agricultural collectivization. The NEP's days are numbered. In October 1928, the first 5-year plan is formally launched. Its targets are staggering. Steel production is to quadruple, coal output is to double, entire industrial cities are to rise from empty steppe. At Magnitogorsk in the southern Urals, tens of thousands of workers, many of them peasants who have never seen a factory, begin constructing what will become one of the largest steel plants on Earth. The site is chosen for its iron ore deposits, and the city grows around the furnaces, a monument to planned economy ambition. Hundreds of kilometers to the south, on the Dnieper River in Ukraine, the Dneprostroi hydroelectric dam takes shape, the largest in Europe at its completion, a cathedral of concrete and turbines that will electrify entire regions and appear on countless propaganda posters as proof that socialism can outbuild capitalism. The human machinery of this transformation is the Communist Party itself, now purged of dissent and organized as a transmission belt from Stalin's Kremlin office to the remotest factory floor. Party secretaries in every district receive production quotas and face consequences for failure. A new visual culture emerges, posters depicting muscular workers forging steel, smiling collective farmers harvesting golden wheat, engineers studying blueprints beneath red banners. The image of the new Soviet man saturates newspapers, cinema screens, and factory walls. He is selfless, disciplined, devoted to the collective, indifferent to personal comfort. Behind the imagery, coercion accelerates. The grain crisis of 1928, when peasants withhold harvests from state purchasers at low, fixed prices, convinces Stalin that the countryside must be brought to heel. Emergency requisitioning measures revive memories of war communism. By 1929, the decision crystallizes into policy: mass collectivization of agriculture, the liquidation of the kulaks as a class. Private farming, the backbone of Russian life for centuries, is to be abolished. Stalin's office in the Kremlin, a modest room lined with books and maps, becomes the nerve center of a command economy unprecedented in scale. Every major allocation, every industrial priority, every political appointment flows through this room or through the small circle of loyalists who occupy it. The party congresses still convene, delegates still applaud, resolutions still pass unanimously. But the deliberation that once characterized Bolshevik politics has vanished. What remains is execution of plans, of quotas, and increasingly of people who fail to meet them. The Soviet Union at the close of the 1920s stands on the threshold of a transformation so violent and so vast that its consequences will echo for generations. The transformation begins in the villages. Across the vast agricultural heartland of the Soviet Union, from the Black Earth regions of Ukraine to the endless Kazakh steppe, the ancient rhythm of peasant life is shattered in a campaign of deliberate, systematic violence. In January 1930, the Politburo issues a decree on the liquidation of the kulaks as a class. The word kulak, once meaning a prosperous peasant, now becomes a death sentence applied with terrifying imprecision. Local officials, given quotas for enemies to identify, sweep through communities seizing grain, livestock, tools, homes. Families are loaded onto freight cars in the dead of winter and deported to Siberia, the Urals, Central Asia. An estimated 1.8 million people are deported in the first 2 years alone. Tens of thousands die in transit. The collective farms, kolkhozy, rise on the emptied land. Peasants who remain are forced to surrender their private plots, their animals, their seed grain to the new collective structures. Resistance is immediate and desperate. Across Ukraine, the North Caucasus, and the Volga region, peasants slaughter their own livestock rather than hand them to the state. Between 1929 and 1933, the Soviet Union loses roughly half its horses and nearly half its cattle. The agricultural base is gutted at the precise moment the state demands ever greater grain deliveries to feed the cities and fund industrial imports. By the summer of 1932, catastrophe descends. In Ukraine, where the harvest falls short but requisition quotas remain merciless, villages begin to starve. Brigades arrive to search homes, confiscating hidden grain down to the last handful. Internal passports introduced in December 1932 prevent peasants from fleeing to cities. Entire communities are blacklisted, denied access to any goods. Through the winter of 1932 to 33, the Holodomor consumes Ukraine. Bodies lie in streets and fields. Families perish behind closed doors. An estimated 3.5 to 5 million Ukrainians die. Simultaneously, famine ravages Kazakhstan, killing roughly 1.5 million, more than a third of the Kazakh population. The North Caucasus and the Volga suffer terribly. The state knows. Reports reach Moscow. The grain exports continue. Yet even as millions perish, the industrial machine accelerates with ferocious energy. Magnitogorsk rises from barren steppe east of the Urals, a steel city built in 3 years where nothing stood before. The Dniprostroi Dam on the Dnieper River, upon completion in 1932, the largest hydroelectric station in the world, channels power to new aluminum and steel plants. The Stalingrad tractor factory, the Gorky automobile plant, the Kharkov turbine works, each represents a leap from agrarian backwardness toward industrial modernity achieved through forced labor, impossible schedules, and human expenditure treated as an acceptable cost. The Belomor Canal, connecting the White Sea to the Baltic, is carved between 1931 and 1933 by over 100,000 Gulag prisoners using hand tools in Arctic conditions. 12,000 or more die. The canal, too shallow for most military vessels, stands as a monument to the regime's willingness to spend lives for symbolic achievements. By 1934, the first 5-year plan has been declared fulfilled ahead of schedule, though the statistics are inflated and the human toll is concealed. Soviet steel production has quadrupled. Coal output has tripled. The foundations of a heavy industrial economy now exist where 5 years earlier there were fields and forests. The second 5-year plan, launched in 1933, shifts emphasis slightly toward consumer goods and consolidation, though heavy industry remains paramount. The Stakhanovite movement, named after a coal miner who in August 1935 reportedly exceeded his quota by 14 times, becomes a propaganda campaign demanding superhuman productivity from ordinary workers. The Soviet Union by the mid-1930s has become the world's second-largest industrial power. Factories hum. Dams generate electricity. New cities house hundreds of thousands. The cost is buried in unmarked graves across the steppe, in the frozen earth of labor camps, in the silence imposed upon an entire generation of survivors who learned that the state's hunger for progress devours its own people without hesitation and without remorse. On the 1st of December 1934, a young communist named Leonid Nikolaev walks into the Smolny Institute in Leningrad and fires a single bullet into the back of Sergei Kirov's head. Kirov, the popular party chief of Leningrad, dies on the corridor floor. Within hours, Stalin arrives by train to personally oversee the investigation. Whether Stalin himself orchestrated the murder remains one of Soviet history's darkest uncertainties, but the consequences are immediate and unmistakable. That very night, Stalin drafts emergency decrees accelerating the investigation and trial of political crimes, stripping defendants of appeal rights, mandating execution within 24 hours of sentencing. Kirov's death becomes the key that unlocks a door into mass terror. Through 1935, arrests multiply quietly. Former oppositionists, expelled party members, old intellectuals with pre-revolutionary connections, the NKVD, the secret police apparatus now commanded by Genrikh Yagoda, gathers them into the Lubyanka's basement cells in Moscow and into regional prisons across the Union. But the spectacle begins in August 1936, inside the Hall of Columns in Moscow's House of the Unions. Beneath crystal chandeliers, Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, men who once stood beside Lenin, who debated the revolution's direction in its earliest hours, sit as defendants in the first great show trial. They confess to conspiring with Trotsky, to plotting Stalin's assassination, to sabotaging the socialist state. The confessions are extracted through weeks of psychological torture, threats against family members, and exhaustion. Both are convicted. Both are shot. In January 1937, a second trial dispatches Karl Radek and Yuri Pyatakov. By now, Stalin has replaced Yagoda with Nikolai Yezhov, a diminutive and ruthless figure whose name becomes synonymous with the terror itself, the Yezhovshchina. Under Yezhov's command, the NKVD receives quotas. Each region must deliver a specified number of enemies, so many to be executed, so many to be sentenced to labor camps. Local officials, desperate to meet or exceed their targets, sweep up factory workers, school teachers, collective farm chairmen, priests, ethnic minorities, and random citizens denounced by frightened neighbors. In June 1937, Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky and 7 senior Red Army commanders are arrested, tried in secret, and executed within a single day. Over the following 18 months, 3 of 5 marshals, 13 of 15 army commanders, and roughly 35,000 officers are purged from the military, imprisoned or killed. The army that must soon face the most powerful war machine in European history is systematically decapitated. The third and final great show trial unfolds in March 1938. Nikolai Bukharin, once called the party's favorite, stands accused of espionage and wrecking. His confession, delivered with strange philosophical detachment, becomes a document studied for decades afterward. He is shot on the 15th of March. Beyond Moscow, the Gulag expands to its terrible maturity. Camps stretch from the Solovetsky Islands in the White Sea to Kolyma in the far northeast, where winter temperatures plunge below -50 degrees. Prisoners mine gold, fell timber, dig canals, and build railways. Mortality rates in the harshest camps reach catastrophic levels. By 1938, the Gulag holds approximately 1.5 million prisoners, though the total number who pass through its gates across these years is far greater. Then the terror consumes its own instrument. In November 1938, Yezhov is quietly removed. Lavrenti Beria replaces him. Yezhov himself is arrested, tried, and executed in February 1940. The machine briefly slows. Mass operations cease. Some prisoners are released. But the apparatus remains intact, the fear permanently embedded in Soviet consciousness. An estimated 750,000 people have been executed during the Great Terror alone. Millions more carry sentences in camps and exile. The state that emerges from this self-inflicted wound is paradoxically both stronger and profoundly weakened, its industrial base vast, its military gutted, its population conditioned to absolute obedience, and its capacity for honest self-assessment destroyed at precisely the moment when the world outside its borders grows more dangerous with every passing month. That growing danger has a name, and Moscow knows it well. Throughout the 1930s, Soviet foreign policy oscillates between two impulses: the pursuit of collective security against fascism and the cold recognition that no Western power truly regards the Soviet Union as an equal partner. Maxim Litvinov, the Cosmopolitan Commissar for Foreign Affairs, champions the League of Nations, signs mutual assistance pacts with France and Czechoslovakia in 1935, and warns repeatedly that Adolf Hitler's Germany poses an existential threat to European peace. Soviet volunteers, advisors, and weapons flow to Republican Spain beginning in 1936, a proxy war where Soviet tanks and aircraft face German and Italian hardware in the hills of Castile and along the Ebro. Yet the Western democracies remain distant. Britain and France pursue appeasement. At Munich in September 1938, they hand Czechoslovakia's Sudetenland to Hitler without consulting Moscow, despite the existing Soviet-Czech treaty. Stalin draws a devastating conclusion. The West would happily redirect German aggression eastward. In May 1939, Litvinov is replaced by Vyacheslav Molotov, a signal unmistakable in its meaning. Negotiations with Britain and France for a triple alliance drag through the summer, foundering on Polish refusal to permit Soviet troops on its territory and on Western reluctance to grant Moscow a sphere of influence in the Baltic. Meanwhile, in absolute secrecy, Soviet and German diplomats begin talking. On the 23rd of August 1939, in the Kremlin, Molotov and German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop sign a non-aggression pact that stuns the world. The published text pledges neutrality. The secret additional protocol carves Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Eastern Poland fall to Moscow, Lithuania and Western Poland to Berlin. 9 days later, on the 1st of September, Germany invades Poland. On the 17th, the Red Army crosses Poland's eastern border, meeting little organized resistance. Soviet and German officers shake hands at the demarcation line along the Bug River. Poland ceases to exist as a state. What follows in the occupied territories is systematic. In the spring of 1940, the Soviet secret police executes over 21,000 Polish officers, intellectuals, and officials. The Katyn massacre, buried in forest graves and denied for half a century. The Baltic states are next. In June 1940, Soviet ultimatums demand the installation of pro-Moscow governments. Tanks roll into Tallinn, Riga, and Vilnius. Rigged elections follow. By August, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are formally annexed as Soviet republics. Romania is forced to cede Bessarabia and northern Bukovina that same month. But Finland refuses. When Soviet forces invade on the 30th of November 1939, expecting swift victory, they encounter ferocious resistance. Finnish soldiers on skis shatter entire Soviet divisions in the frozen forests of Karelia. The Winter War exposes the Red Army's catastrophic weaknesses. The very officer corps gutted by the purges cannot coordinate basic operations. After 3.5 months of humiliating losses, Moscow achieves a negotiated peace in March 1940, gaining territory but at the cost of international prestige and nearly 200,000 Soviet casualties. Stalin watches Germany conquer France in 6 weeks during the summer of 1940 and understands the pact is borrowed time. Soviet factories accelerate weapons production. New tank designs enter development. The frontier fortifications of the old border, dismantled after the westward expansion, are not replaced. The new territories, a buffer zone purchased with moral compromise, lack defensive infrastructure. Intelligence reports of German military buildup along the border accumulate through the winter of 1940–41. Stalin dismisses them, convinced that Hitler will not fight a two-front war, convinced that the pact still holds. The buffer zone stretches from the Arctic to the Black Sea, populated by millions of newly absorbed citizens who regard Moscow not as liberator, but as occupier. The secret protocols remain hidden from the world. The devil's bargain has purchased perhaps 22 months of preparation, industrial relocation plans, and territorial depth. Whether it is enough will be answered at dawn on the 22nd of June 1941, when 3 million German soldiers cross the frontier and the borrowed time expires in fire. At 3:15 in the morning on the 22nd of June 1941, the borrowed time ends. Along a front stretching more than 1,800 miles from the Baltic coast to the Black Sea, 3,300,000 Axis soldiers surge forward in the largest military invasion in human history. Operation Barbarossa opens with a coordinated annihilation of Soviet air power. Within hours, over 1,200 aircraft are destroyed, most still parked on their airfields, many never leaving the ground. The sky belongs to the Luftwaffe before sunrise. The scale of the catastrophe defies comprehension. 3 German army groups advance simultaneously. Army Group North driving toward Leningrad, Army Group Center toward Moscow through Minsk and Smolensk, Army Group South toward Kiev and the Ukrainian heartland. Soviet frontier units, many stationed in the recently annexed territories with incomplete fortifications, are overrun in hours. Communication lines are severed. Commanders cannot reach Moscow. Moscow cannot reach the front. Stalin retreats into silence. For nearly 2 weeks after the invasion begins, the Soviet leader is paralyzed, secluded at his Kuntsevo dacha, unable or unwilling to address the nation. When he finally speaks by radio on the 3rd of July, his voice is halting, unfamiliar. He addresses the people not with party slogans, but as brothers and sisters. The war he refused to believe would come has arrived with annihilating force. The encirclements are staggering. At Minsk in late June, over 300,000 Soviet soldiers are trapped. At Smolensk in July, another 300,000. At Kiev in September, the single largest encirclement in military history, captures over 600,000 Soviet troops. By the end of 1941, approximately 3 million Soviet soldiers have fallen into German captivity, where most will perish from starvation, exposure, and deliberate murder in open-air camps. Yet amid the devastation, something extraordinary occurs. Behind the collapsing front, 1,500 factories are dismantled piece by piece, loaded onto railway cars, and evacuated eastward beyond the Ural Mountains to Chelyabinsk, Sverdlovsk, Novosibirsk, and dozens of other cities. Entire industrial complexes are reassembled in open fields, sometimes producing tanks and ammunition within weeks of arrival. Workers laboring through Siberian winter under canvas roofs before walls are even built. On the 8th of September, German and Finnish forces complete the encirclement of Leningrad. The siege that begins will last nearly 900 days. The city of 3 million is cut off from all land supply. As autumn turns to winter, rations fall to 125 grams of bread per day. Bread mixed with sawdust and cellulose. Hundreds of thousands will die of starvation in the coming months, their bodies stacked in courtyards and along frozen streets. Army Group Center presses toward Moscow. By October, Operation Typhoon launches the final drive. At Vyazma and Bryansk, another 600,000 Soviet soldiers are encircled. Panic grips the capital on the 16th of October. Government offices burn documents, civilians flee eastward, and looting breaks out. Yet Stalin remains in Moscow, and that decision steadies the defense. Fresh Siberian divisions, trained for winter warfare, and confirmed by intelligence that Japan will not attack from the east, are rushed westward along the Trans-Siberian Railway. December brings temperatures plunging below -30 degrees. German supply lines stretch thin across frozen mud turned to iron. Engines will not start. Soldiers lack winter clothing. On the 5th of December 1941, the Soviet counteroffensive before Moscow begins. Fresh divisions strike along a 200-mile front, driving the Wehrmacht back between 100 and 250 kilometers from the capital. It is the first major German defeat of the war. Moscow will not fall. The cost is beyond reckoning. In 6 months, the Soviet Union has lost territory home to 40% of its population, vast agricultural lands, and critical industrial capacity. Millions of soldiers are dead or captured. Millions of civilians are trapped under occupation. But the state has not collapsed. The factories beyond the Urals are accelerating production. The army is rebuilding. The winter has revealed that the Wehrmacht is not invincible. The war that will consume 27 million Soviet lives has only begun. The spring of 1942 brings no respite. The Wehrmacht, bloodied before Moscow but far from broken, regroups for a renewed offensive. Hitler's strategic gaze shifts southward, toward the oil fields of the Caucasus and the industrial city sprawling along the western bank of the Volga. Stalingrad, bearing the name of the Soviet leader himself, becomes the focal point of a struggle that will determine the trajectory of the entire war. Through the summer, German forces advance across the Don steppe under blazing skies, their armored columns raising pillars of dust visible for miles. On the 23rd of August 1942, the Luftwaffe unleashes a devastating aerial bombardment that transforms Stalingrad into a landscape of shattered concrete and twisted steel. The Volga itself seems to burn as oil storage tanks erupt along the riverbank. Within days, the city that housed 500,000 people becomes an inferno. What follows is combat reduced to its most elemental form. In the ruins of the tractor factory, the Red October steel works, and the Barricadi gun factory, Soviet and German soldiers fight room by room, floor by floor, sometimes wall by wall. The grain elevator changes hands repeatedly in engagements measured in meters. Snipers haunt the rubble. Sewers become supply routes. The average life expectancy of a newly arrived Soviet soldier is measured in hours. General Vasily Chuikov commands the 62nd Army from a bunker carved into the Volga bluffs, holding the narrowest of footholds while reinforcements cross the river under constant fire. Yet as Friedrich Paulus commits ever more divisions into the urban grinder, Soviet commanders Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky prepare something far larger. Operation Uranus launches on the 19th of November 1942. Soviet forces strike north and south of the city, smashing through the weaker Romanian armies guarding the German flanks. Within 4 days, the pincers close at Kalach-on-Don. The entire German 6th Army, roughly 300,000 men, is encircled. Hitler forbids withdrawal. Hermann Goering promises an airlift that never delivers sufficient supplies. The frozen steppe becomes a tomb. Starving, frost-bitten, and running out of ammunition, the remnants of the 6th Army surrender on the 2nd of February 1943. Field Marshal Paulus, promoted to that rank only the day before in the expectation he would choose suicide over capitulation, walks into Soviet captivity. Combined casualties on both sides exceed 2 million. The psychological reversal is seismic. For the first time, an entire German field army has been destroyed. Soviet confidence surges. Across occupied Europe, resistance movements take heart. The initiative, so long held by the Wehrmacht, begins its irreversible transfer. That summer, Hitler gambles once more at Kursk, where a massive Soviet salient bulges westward. The Germans assemble their finest armored divisions for Operation Citadel. But Soviet intelligence, aided by partisan networks operating deep behind enemy lines and by decoded signals, knows the plan. The Red Army constructs 8 concentric defensive belts of trenches, minefields, and anti-tank positions reaching depths of nearly 200 kilometers. When the German offensive begins on the 5th of July 1943, it grinds into the deepest prepared defenses in military history. Near Prokhorovka on the 12th of July, hundreds of tanks clash at close range in fields of sunflowers and smoke. Within weeks, the offensive is spent. The Soviet counterattack that follows liberates Orel and Belgorod. On the 5th of August, Moscow fires its first victory salutes of the war. Kharkov falls to Soviet forces for the final time on the 23rd of August. The Red Army, now supplied by a war economy producing tens of thousands of tanks and aircraft annually, supplemented by American trucks, food, and raw materials through Lend-Lease, advances westward with gathering momentum. Behind the German lines, partisan brigades numbering hundreds of thousands disrupt railways, ambush convoys, and tie down occupation forces. The war is far from over. Millions more will die before it ends. But after Stalingrad and Kursk, the fundamental question has changed. It is no longer whether the Soviet Union will survive. It is how far west its armies will march. The answer to that question becomes clear across the spring and summer of 1944. The Red Army, now numbering over 6 million men along the Eastern Front, launches a series of massive offensives that shatter German defenses across a continent-wide arc. In the south, Soviet forces drive into Romania and the Balkans. In the north, the 900-day siege of Leningrad is fully lifted in January. But the most devastating blow falls on the 23rd of June, the third anniversary of the German invasion, when Operation Bagration erupts along a front stretching across Belorussia. The scale is staggering. Over 1,700,000 Soviet troops, supported by thousands of tanks, artillery pieces and aircraft, strike Army Group Center in coordinated waves. Within days, the German front disintegrates. Entire divisions are encircled and annihilated in the forests and swamps east of Minsk. By early July, Minsk itself is liberated, and the wreckage of 28 German divisions lies scattered across Belorussia. It is the single greatest defeat in German military history, dwarfing even Stalingrad in the scale of forces destroyed. Soviet tanks push westward with relentless speed, reaching the outskirts of Warsaw by August. Across Eastern Europe, the old order collapses. Romania switches sides in August. Bulgaria falls in September. Belgrade is liberated in October with Yugoslav partisan assistance. Hungary becomes a battlefield through the winter. As Soviet forces advance, they encounter the evidence of systematic extermination. The death camps at Majdanek, liberated in July 1944, and Auschwitz, reached on the 27th of January 1945. Soviet soldiers, many of whom have witnessed years of atrocity on their own soil, now confront the industrial machinery of genocide. In February 1945, Stalin meets Roosevelt and Churchill at Yalta in the Crimea. The conference shapes the post-war world. The division of Germany into occupation zones, the promise of free elections in liberated countries, Soviet entry into the war against Japan, and the foundations of the United Nations. Behind the diplomatic language lies a harder reality. The Red Army occupies the ground, and possession determines political outcomes far more than agreements on paper. The final offensive begins on the 16th of April, 1945. 2.5 million Soviet soldiers under Marshals Zhukov and Konev assault the German defenses along the Oder and Neisse rivers. The fighting is ferocious. The Silo Heights cost tens of thousands of casualties in 4 days. But by the 20th of April, Soviet artillery shells are falling on central Berlin. The battle for the capital becomes a grinding advance through rubble-choked streets, basement to basement, block by block. On the 30th of April, soldiers of the 150th Rifle Division raise the red banner over the Reichstag. That same day, in a bunker beneath the ruined chancellery, the war's architect takes his own life. Germany surrenders unconditionally on the 8th of May. In Moscow, the announcement comes after midnight, making the 9th of May the official Victory Day. Crowds fill Red Square in spontaneous celebration. Soldiers weep, strangers embrace. Fireworks illuminate the Kremlin towers. But the landscape behind the celebrating armies tells a different story. Across the Western Soviet Union, 1,700 towns and 70,000 villages have been destroyed. 27 million Soviet citizens are dead. Soldiers, civilians, prisoners of war, victims of siege, famine, and genocide. Entire generations of young men have been erased. The demographic wound will never fully heal. At the Potsdam Conference in July and August 1945, the victors finalized Germany's partition and the new European order. Soviet-dominated governments begin taking shape across Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. The alliance that defeated fascism is already fracturing under the weight of incompatible visions for the post-war world. The Red Army stands in the heart of Europe, from the Elbe to the Pacific. The Soviet Union has purchased its survival and its empire at a cost almost beyond human comprehension. The victory is real. The ashes are everywhere. The ashes are still warm when the new world begins to take shape. Across Eastern Europe, Soviet military governors oversee the installation of coalition governments in which communist parties, however small their pre-war membership, hold the decisive ministries: interior, defense, information. In Poland, the Lublin Committee transforms into a provisional government. In Romania, King Michael is forced to appoint a communist-led cabinet in March 1945. In Bulgaria, the Fatherland Front consolidates power through purges of wartime collaborators that sweep far beyond actual fascists. The pattern repeats with local variations but identical outcomes: elections managed, opposition leaders arrested or exiled, Social Democrats forcibly merged with communist parties, and by 1948, a belt of single-party states stretches from the Baltic to the Adriatic. In Fulton, Missouri, on the 5th of March 1946, Winston Churchill names what the world already senses. An iron curtain has descended across the continent. From Stettin on the Baltic to Trieste on the Adriatic, the capitals of ancient states now lie within the Soviet sphere. Moscow dismisses the speech as warmongering, but the metaphor endures because it describes a reality hardening by the month. The Truman Doctrine of March 1947 and the Marshall Plan that follows draw the economic battle lines. Stalin forbids his satellites from accepting American aid, and in September 1947 establishes the Communist Information Bureau, the Cominform, to coordinate the international communist movement from a position of ideological discipline. When Yugoslavia's Josip Broz Tito resists Soviet control, insisting on an independent path to socialism, Stalin expels Yugoslavia from the Cominform in June 1948. The break sends tremors through every satellite capital. Purge trials targeting alleged Titoists sweep through Budapest, Prague, and Sofia. Berlin becomes the crisis point. In June 1948, the Soviet military administration blockades all road, rail, and canal access to the western sectors of the city, attempting to force the Western Allies out. For nearly 11 months, American and British aircraft sustain over 2 million West Berliners through an airlift of astonishing scale, delivering coal, food, and medicine in flights landing every few minutes at Tempelhof. The blockade fails, and in May 1949 it is lifted. That same month, the Federal Republic of Germany is proclaimed in the West. In October, the German Democratic Republic rises in the East. Two Germanys now face each other across the deepest fault line in Europe. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, formed in April 1949, binds the Western Allies into a military alliance explicitly aimed at containing Soviet expansion. Then, on the 29th of August 1949, a flash of light erupts over the Semipalatinsk test site in the Kazakh steppe. The Soviet Union detonates its first atomic device, ending the American nuclear monopoly 4 years after Hiroshima. The intelligence operation that accelerated the program, drawing on espionage from Klaus Fuchs and others embedded in the Manhattan Project, has given Soviet physicists under Igor Kurchatov a critical advantage. The world now has two nuclear powers, and the logic of mutual annihilation begins its long reign. In June 1950, North Korean forces cross the 38th parallel, plunging the Korean peninsula into war. Stalin approves the invasion, provides weapons and advisors, and Soviet pilots fly combat missions in unmarked aircraft over the Yalu River. The conflict kills millions and ends in 1953, with the peninsula divided almost exactly where it began. At home, late Stalinism tightens its grip. The Zhdanov doctrine enforces rigid ideological conformity in arts and sciences. 7 massive wedding cake skyscrapers rise above Moscow's skyline, monuments to socialist realist grandeur and imperial ambition fused into concrete and stone. In January 1953, Pravda announces the discovery of a conspiracy among Kremlin doctors, mostly Jewish, allegedly plotting to poison Soviet leaders. The doctors' plot unleashes a wave of anti-Semitic hysteria and signals a possible new purge. It never comes. On the 1st of March 1953, guards at the Kuntsevo dacha find Stalin collapsed on the floor, felled by a cerebral hemorrhage. For hours, no one dares enter. He lingers for days, surrounded by lieutenants who have survived his terror for decades. On the 5th of March, Joseph Stalin dies. The man who shaped the Soviet Union more than any figure since Lenin leaves behind a nuclear-armed superpower, an empire of satellite states, and a society paralyzed between grief and unspoken relief. The question of what comes next belongs to men who have known nothing but obedience. The men who inherit Stalin's empire move with the cautious instinct of survivors. Within hours of his death, a collective leadership emerges. Georgy Malenkov assumes the premiership, Vyacheslav Molotov returns to foreign affairs, and Lavrenti Beria, the feared chief of the secret police, positions himself as the indispensable man. But Beria's reach for power alarms every colleague who understands what his files contain. By June 1953, Nikita Khrushchev orchestrates a conspiracy among the Presidium. Beria is arrested at gunpoint during a meeting in the Kremlin, tried in secret, and executed in December. The instrument of Stalin's terror becomes its final victim. Khrushchev, the stout Ukrainian-born apparatchik whom rivals underestimate, maneuvers patiently. He outflanks Malenkov, sidelines Molotov, and by 1955 holds the decisive post of First Secretary. His power secured, he does something no one anticipates. On the 25th of February 1956, in a closed session of the 20th Party Congress, Khrushchev delivers a speech that shatters the mythology of an era. For 4 hours he catalogues Stalin's crimes, the mass arrests, the torture of loyal communists, the catastrophic military blunders of 1941, the cult of personality that perverted Leninist principles. Delegates sit in stunned silence. Some weep. Within weeks, the speech leaks across the communist world, and nothing is ever the same. The thaw ripples outward with consequences Khrushchev cannot control. In Poland, workers riot in Poznan. In Hungary, the ripples become a revolution. On the 23rd of October 1956, Budapest erupts. Students and workers demand free elections, the withdrawal of Soviet troops, and the return of Imre Nagy as premier. For days, it appears Moscow might accept reform. Then Nagy announces Hungary's withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact. On the 4th of November, Soviet tanks roll through Budapest in force. 2,500 Hungarians die. 200,000 flee westward. The message is clear. De-Stalinization has boundaries, and those boundaries are drawn in armor. Yet domestically, transformation accelerates. Millions return from the Gulag. Censorship loosens enough for Alexander Solzhenitsyn's account of camp life to appear in a literary journal. Khrushchev launches the Virgin Lands campaign, ploughing vast Kazakh steppes into grain fields. He orders the construction of millions of prefabricated apartment units, modest 5-story blocks that Soviet citizens call Khrushchevki, replacing communal squalor with private kitchens and bathrooms for ordinary families. Then comes the triumph that stuns the world. On the 4th of October 1957, a modified intercontinental ballistic missile lifts a polished aluminum sphere into orbit from the Baikonur Cosmodrome in the Kazakh desert. Sputnik circles the Earth every 96 minutes, its radio signal beeping across every frequency. The space age belongs to the Soviet Union. On the 12th of April 1961, Yuri Gagarin completes a single orbit aboard Vostok 1, becoming the first human being in space. Moscow celebrates with a euphoria not seen since Victory Day. But Khrushchev's boldness carries risk. On the 13th of August 1961, East German authorities begin constructing a wall through the heart of Berlin, sealing the border with concrete and barbed wire. A year later, Khrushchev gambles further, secretly deploying nuclear missiles to Cuba. When American reconnaissance aircraft discovered the sites in October 1962, the world stands closer to annihilation than at any moment in history. For 13 days, 2 nuclear powers negotiate at the edge of extinction. The missiles are withdrawn. A direct communication line, the so-called hotline, is established between Moscow and Washington. The crisis exposes Khrushchev's volatility. His agricultural reforms falter as Virgin Lands harvests decline. The Sino-Soviet split deepens into open ideological warfare with Beijing. Party officials tire of his impulsive reorganizations and public embarrassments. On the 14th of October 1964, while Khrushchev vacations at his Black Sea dacha, the Central Committee votes unanimously to remove him. He is informed by telephone. No arrest, no trial, no execution, a first in Soviet leadership transitions. He retires to obscurity, tending his garden, dictating memoirs no publisher in Moscow will touch. The thaw ends quietly, replaced by men who promise stability above all else. The stability those men promise takes shape not in grand speeches, but in the quiet rhythms of ordinary life, and it is within those rhythms that the Soviet experiment reveals its most intimate contradictions. A communal apartment in Leningrad, sometime in the 1960s. A single corridor stretches past 7 doors, each opening into a room where an entire family sleeps, eats, studies, and argues. The kitchen at the corridor's end holds 7 stoves, 7 small tables, 7 sets of pots blackened by years of use. Neighbors share a single telephone mounted on the hallway wall, conversations audible to everyone. Privacy is a bourgeois luxury the revolution never promised. Yet within these cramped spaces, children grow up surrounded by accidental community. An engineer's daughter learning piano beside a factory worker's son memorizing Pushkin for school. The communal apartment is both the state's failure to build enough housing and an unintended laboratory of Soviet social mixing. Beyond the apartment door, the factory whistle governs time. Shifts begin at 7 in the morning across thousands of enterprises from Minsk to Novosibirsk. Workers clock in beneath banners proclaiming production targets for the current 5-year plan. The pay is modest but predictable. Dismissal is nearly impossible. A metal worker in Sverdlovsk earns enough for rent, bread, and basic clothing, but a winter coat requires months of saving, and a private automobile remains a fantasy fulfilled only after years on a waiting list. The queue becomes the defining institution of Soviet consumer life. Hours spent outside state shops for butter, shoes, oranges appearing once a season, or Yugoslav furniture rumored to arrive on Thursday. On the collective farms, a different exhaustion prevails. Women outnumber men in the fields, a demographic scar left by the war. The kolkhoz provides grain to the state at fixed prices, while farmers tend private garden plots that, though occupying barely 3% of cultivated land, produce nearly a third of the country's vegetables and meat. This quiet paradox, the private plot outperforming the collective field, is known to everyone and discussed by no one in official settings. Children enter the system early. By age 7, a Soviet child sits in a classroom beneath a portrait of Lenin, learning to read from standardized textbooks distributed identically from Tallinn to Tashkent. Literacy, which stood at roughly 28% in 1917, reaches near universal levels by the 1960s. At 10, the red pioneer scarf is tied around the neck. At 14, the Komsomol card enters the pocket. Education is free through university. Healthcare costs nothing at the point of service. These achievements are real, measurable, and genuinely transformative for millions born into families that under the Tsar would never have seen a doctor or opened a book. Yet the system breathes through its cracks. Samizdat manuscripts pass hand to hand, Solzhenitsyn's forbidden prose, Brodsky's poetry, typed on carbon paper until the 5th copy is barely legible. Western rock music arrives on used X-ray film, bootleg recordings called Bones. Jazz clubs operate in semi-tolerated ambiguity. Soviet cinema produces masterworks alongside propaganda, and audiences learn to read between the frames. Women carry a double burden celebrated in rhetoric and ignored in policy. Full employment in factories and offices followed by full responsibility for children, cooking, and the endless hunt for groceries. Ethnic minorities in Central Asia, the Caucasus, and the Baltic republics navigate between Moscow's insistence on Soviet identity and the persistence of language, custom, and quiet resentment. Mosques and churches stand open but monitored, their congregations aging as the young are steered toward atheist conviction. The Dacha offers seasonal escape. On summer weekends, trains leaving Moscow overflow with families carrying seedlings, jam jars, and fishing rods, heading to small wooden cottages where the state recedes to a murmur. Here, in garden rows of cucumbers and dill, the Soviet citizen finds something close to autonomy. This is the texture of the world Brezhnev's promise of stability sustains, a world of genuine security and genuine scarcity, of collective achievement and individual compromise, where the gap between what the posters proclaim and what the kitchen table knows grows wider with each passing year, quietly, steadily, like a crack in concrete that no one is authorized to report. That crack runs deeper than anyone in the Kremlin acknowledges. By the late 1960s, the system Leonid Brezhnev presides over has perfected the art of appearing permanent. The General Secretary himself embodies this illusion, a broad-chested figure whose chest accumulates medals with each passing year, over 200 decorations eventually pinned to suits tailored to bear their weight. His face, heavy-jawed and increasingly immobile, gazes from portraits in every government office, every factory entrance, every military barracks across 11 time zones. The machinery beneath that portrait runs on loyalty, not innovation. The nomenclatura, the vast network of party-appointed officials controlling every significant position from factory directors to regional governors, solidifies into a self-perpetuating caste. Promotions depend on connections, not competence. Retirement is rare. The average age of the Politburo climbs past 65, then past 70. The men governing a nuclear superpower can barely climb the steps of the Lenin Mausoleum on parade days. Abroad, the doctrine bearing Brezhnev's name is tested first in Prague. In January 1968, Alexander Dubček's Czechoslovak reforms, Socialism with a Human Face, alarm Moscow. On the night of August 20th, 200,000 Warsaw-packed troops cross the border. Tanks grind through Prague's cobblestone streets. The message is unambiguous. No socialist state may leave the Soviet orbit. The Brezhnev Doctrine formalizes what Hungarian blood already proved in 1956. Yet even as tanks enforce orthodoxy in Eastern Europe, Brezhnev pursues détente with the West. The Strategic Arms Limitation talks produce agreements in 1972. The Helsinki Accords of 1975 recognize post-war European borders, a Soviet triumph. But their human rights provisions become unexpected weapons in the hands of dissidents. Andrei Sakharov, father of the Soviet hydrogen bomb, demands democratic reforms from internal exile in Gorky. Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, published abroad in 1973, lays bare the camp system's horror for the world. The state responds with psychiatric hospitals, labor camps, and forced emigration. But the dissident voice, once raised, cannot be entirely silenced. The economy, meanwhile, masks its deterioration behind petroleum revenues. Vast pipelines stretch across western Siberia, feeding hard currency into state coffers as global oil prices surge through the 1970s. The Baikal-Amur mainline railway, declared a project of the century, crawls across eastern Siberia at enormous cost. But beneath the energy wealth, growth rates decline steadily. Factories produce goods nobody wants. Agricultural yields stagnate despite massive investment. The command economy that built Magnitogorsk cannot manufacture reliable consumer electronics or keep meat on store shelves. Then comes Afghanistan. On December 24, 1979, Soviet airborne troops seize Kabul. What Moscow envisions as a brief stabilization operation becomes a grinding, decade-long war. Young conscripts from Minsk and Tashkent fight mujahideen guerrillas in mountain passes where empires have always bled. The 1980 Moscow Olympics, intended to showcase Soviet achievement, are boycotted by the United States and dozens of allied nations. The grand stadiums feel half empty. Brezhnev dies on November 10, 1982, his final years marked by visible physical decline, slurred speech, shuffling gait, a body sustained by physicians while the state drifts. Yuri Andropov, former head of the security services, succeeds him with promises of discipline and anti-corruption campaigns. But kidney failure kills him on February 9, 1984, after barely 15 months. Konstantin Chernenko, older and sicker still, follows, a leader so frail he can scarcely read his own inauguration speech. He dies on March 10th, 1985. 3 funerals in 28 months. The red-draped gun carriages roll through Moscow with numbing regularity. Foreign leaders arriving for condolences exchange dark humor about return visits. The gerontocracy has consumed itself. Somewhere in the system, a younger man watches, energetic, reform-minded, convinced that socialism can be saved if only it is honest about its failures. The Politburo, exhausted and frightened, turns to him almost by default. Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev is 54 years old when he becomes General Secretary on March 11, 1985, the youngest Soviet leader since Stalin. His energy is immediately visible. He walks factory floors, stops to speak with workers without scripted remarks, and brings his wife Raisa into public life in a manner no Soviet leader has ever attempted. The contrast with his predecessors is so stark it feels almost theatrical, yet it is genuine. He believes the system is salvageable, that its rot is a disease of secrecy and bureaucratic inertia rather than structural failure. The first campaign is against alcohol. In May 1985, sweeping restrictions limit sales, raise prices, and destroy vineyards across Georgia and Moldova. The policy reduces workplace accidents and briefly improves life expectancy, but it devastates state revenues, fuels a black market in homemade spirits, and earns Gorbachev the bitter nickname Mineral Secretary. It is a foretaste of the pattern that will define his tenure. Bold intention, unintended consequence. The deeper reforms arrive under 2 words that will reshape the world. Glasnost, openness, loosens the grip of censorship. Newspapers begin publishing investigations into corruption, environmental disasters, and historical crimes. Perestroika, restructuring, attempts to decentralize economic decision-making, introduce limited market mechanisms, and dismantle the command system's most suffocating layers. State enterprises receive autonomy they have no experience wielding. Cooperatives emerge, occupying a gray space between socialism and capitalism. The economy, already stagnant, lurches into confusion. Then comes Chernobyl. On April 26, 1986, reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power station in northern Ukraine explodes during a safety test. The graphite core burns for days, sending a radioactive plume across Europe. The initial Soviet response is silence. Local authorities hold a May Day parade in nearby Kiev while contamination spreads. The disaster becomes Glasnost's most devastating test case. When the truth emerges, it shatters public trust in the state's competence and honesty more thoroughly than any dissident pamphlet ever could. Over 100,000 people are permanently evacuated. The exclusion zone around the ruined reactor becomes a ghostly monument to systemic failure. Abroad, Gorbachev pursues a transformation equally radical. At summits in Geneva, Reykjavik, and Washington, he and Ronald Reagan negotiate with an intensity that terrifies hardliners on both sides. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, signed in December 1987, eliminates an entire class of nuclear weapons for the first time in history. Gorbachev announces the withdrawal of Soviet forces from Afghanistan, and on February 15, 1989, the last column of armored vehicles crosses the Friendship Bridge into Soviet territory. The 10-year war has cost 15,000 Soviet lives and over 1 million Afghan dead, and it ends not with victory but with a commander walking alone across a bridge in the winter cold. Inside the Union, Glasnost unleashes forces Gorbachev never anticipated. In the Baltic republics, popular fronts organize mass demonstrations demanding sovereignty. In Kazakhstan, protests erupt in December 1986 after Gorbachev replaces the local party chief with a Russian. In the Caucasus, Armenians and Azerbaijanis clash over Nagorno-Karabakh beginning in February 1988. The nationalities question, supposedly solved decades ago, returns with volcanic force. In March 1989, the first competitive elections in Soviet history send shockwaves through the system. The Congress of People's Deputies convenes in May, and for the first time, Soviet citizens watch live televised debates in which deputies openly criticize the party, the military, and the KGB. Factory floors fall silent as workers gather around television sets. The spectacle is electrifying and destabilizing in equal measure. Among the elected deputies is Andrei Sakharov, the dissident physicist once exiled to Gorky, now standing at a microphone demanding the repeal of the party's constitutional monopoly on power. Gorbachev, presiding from the chairman's seat, has opened a door he cannot close. Beyond that door, the world transforms with a speed no one in Moscow or Washington anticipates. The summer of 1989 unfolds like a chain reaction, each link snapping faster than the last, and the geography of post-war Europe begins to dissolve. On August 23, 1989, the 50th anniversary of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, approximately 2 million people in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania join hands in an unbroken human chain stretching over 600 kilometers from Tallinn through Riga to Vilnius. The Baltic Way, as it becomes known, is a protest of breathtaking discipline and emotional power. Entire families stand along roadsides, across bridges, through city centers, holding candles and national flags banned for half a century. The message is unmistakable. These nations remember what was taken from them, and they intend to reclaim it. In Poland, the transformation has already begun. Solidarity, legalized again in April, wins 99 of 100 Senate seats in the June elections. By August, Tadeusz Mazowiecki becomes the first non-communist prime minister in the Eastern Bloc. Hungary opens its border with Austria in September, and East German citizens begin pouring westward through the gap. In Leipzig, Monday demonstrations swell from hundreds to hundreds of thousands. The Sinatra Doctrine, Gorbachev's spokesman's wry declaration that each country may now do it its way, replaces the Brezhnev doctrine of armed intervention. Soviet tanks do not move. On November 9, 1989, an East German spokesman's confused announcement at a press conference triggers a spontaneous rush to the Berlin Wall. By midnight, crowds stand atop the concrete barrier with hammers and champagne, chipping away at the structure that has divided Europe for 28 years. The images broadcast worldwide carry a force beyond politics. Strangers embracing, tears streaming, the sound of concrete crumbling under hand tools. The cascade continues. Bulgaria's leader resigns on November 10th. Czechoslovakia's Velvet Revolution fills Wenceslas Square through late November, and by December, the dissident playwright Václav Havel becomes president. In Romania, the revolution turns violent. Nicolae Ceausescu and his wife are executed on December 25th after a brief trial, the only Eastern Bloc leader to meet such an end. Within the Soviet Union itself, the centrifugal forces accelerate. In April 1989, Soviet troops have already killed 20 demonstrators in Tbilisi, Georgia, using sharpened shovels and toxic gas against a peaceful crowd. In January 1990, Soviet forces storm Baku, Azerbaijan, killing over 100 civilians in a crackdown ostensibly aimed at intercommunal violence, but widely understood as a reassertion of central authority. These acts of repression do not restore control. They destroy whatever remaining legitimacy Moscow holds in the periphery. On March 11, 1990, Lithuania becomes the first Soviet republic to declare independence. Moscow imposes an economic blockade, cutting oil and gas supplies, but the declaration stands. Latvia and Estonia follow with their own declarations of intent. The nationalities question has become the existential question. Germany reunifies on October 3, 1990, absorbing the German Democratic Republic into the Federal Republic. The Warsaw Pact, already hollow, formally dissolves in July 1991. Boris Yeltsin, elected president of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic in June 1991 with 57% of the vote, now commands democratic legitimacy that Gorbachev, who has never faced a popular election, cannot match. The Union's largest republic has chosen a leader whose political survival depends on distinguishing Russia from the Soviet state itself. The architecture of the post-war world, built on the certainty of two superpowers and an immovable line through Europe, has collapsed in barely 2 years. What remains is a Soviet Union whose outermost layers have already fallen away, whose internal republics are pulling apart, and whose center holds power that grows more theoretical with each passing month. The theoretical power becomes openly contested on the night of January 12, 1991, when Soviet special forces storm the Vilnius television tower in Lithuania, killing 14 civilians and injuring hundreds. Tanks crush barricades built from concrete blocks and overturned buses. The crackdown is meant to restore central authority, but it achieves the opposite. It broadcasts to every republic the violence the center is willing to deploy and the weakness it reveals by deploying it. In Riga, similar operations follow days later. The Baltic republics do not capitulate, they harden. Through the spring and summer, Gorbachev pursues the new Union Treaty, a desperate attempt to reconstitute the Soviet state as a voluntary federation of sovereign republics. 9 of the 15 republics tentatively agree to negotiate. The signing is scheduled for August 20th. It never happens. On the morning of August 19th, Soviet citizens awaken to Swan Lake playing on state television, the unmistakable signal of political crisis. A self-declared state committee on the state of emergency announces that Gorbachev is incapacitated and that emergency rule has been imposed. Vice President Gennady Yanayev, KGB Chairman Vladimir Kryuchkov, Defense Minister Dmitry Yazov, and 5 other officials have seized power to preserve the Union by force. Tanks roll through Moscow's streets toward the Russian White House, seat of the Russian parliament. But the coup plotters hesitate. They issue decrees but cannot enforce them. Military units receive contradictory orders. Some commanders refuse to fire on civilians. Boris Yeltsin climbs atop a tank outside the White House and denounces the putsch as illegal, rallying tens of thousands of Muscovites who form human chains around the building through the night. Rain falls on the barricades. 3 young men die in confused confrontations with armored vehicles in a tunnel near the Garden Ring. By August 21st, the coup collapses. Its leaders are arrested. Gorbachev returns from house arrest at his Crimean dacha in Foros, but he returns to a country that no longer exists in any functional sense. Yeltsin suspends the Communist Party of the Soviet Union on Russian territory. Republic after republic declares independence. Ukraine on August 24th, Belarus on August 25th, Moldova on August 27th, Azerbaijan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan in the days that follow. The declarations cascade like falling dominoes through September, October, November. On December 1st, Ukraine holds a referendum in which over 90% of voters choose independence, a result that eliminates any possibility of a reconstituted union, including its second most populous republic. 1 week later, on December 8th, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus meet at a hunting lodge in the Belovezha forest near the Polish border. There, Yeltsin, Leonid Kravchuk, and Stanislav Shushkevich sign the Belovezha Accords, declaring that the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics has ceased to exist as a subject of international law and establishing the Commonwealth of Independent States. On December 21st, the Alma-Ata Protocol extends the Commonwealth to 11 former republics. The 3 Baltic states and Georgia decline to join. On the evening of December 25th, Gorbachev delivers a 12-minute televised resignation address from his Kremlin office. He speaks of the end of the Cold War, of freedoms gained, of a great state that could not hold. At 7:32 that evening, the red hammer and sickle flag descends from the Senate building flagpole above the Kremlin for the final time. The Russian tricolor rises in its place. The nuclear briefcase transfers to Yeltsin. 69 years after its founding in the Bolshoi Theater, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics passes into history, not in revolution or foreign conquest, but in signatures on paper, a quiet speech, and a flag exchanged in winter darkness over a capital that now belongs to a different country. That different country inherits a landscape of ruin and possibility in equal measure. Across Russia in 1992, the economic shock therapy championed by acting Prime Minister Yegor Gaidar liberalizes prices overnight, and inflation devours savings that families accumulated over decades. State enterprises built to serve a planned economy stumble into a market that does not yet exist. Privatization vouchers distributed to 148 million citizens become instruments of concentration rather than distribution, as a small circle of financiers acquires oil fields, aluminum smelters, and television networks for fractions of their value. By the mid-1990s, Russia's gross domestic product has contracted by roughly 40%. Pensioners sell belongings on frozen sidewalks. Factory towns across the Urals fall silent, their smokestacks cold, their workers unpaid for months. Beyond Russia, 14 other successor states navigate their own turbulent passages. The Baltic republics pivot westward, pursuing European Union and NATO membership with an urgency born of historical memory. Ukraine inherits the world's third-largest nuclear arsenal and surrenders it under the Budapest Memorandum of 1994 in exchange for security assurances that will prove hollow. Central Asian republics retain Soviet-era leaders who simply rename themselves presidents. In the Caucasus, war erupts almost immediately. Nagorno-Karabakh bleeds between Armenia and Azerbaijan, while Abkhazia and South Ossetia break from Georgia with Russian support. Transnistria freezes into a sliver of unrecognized statehood along the Dniester River. These conflicts, seeded by Soviet nationality policies and administrative borders drawn in Moscow offices decades earlier, become permanent scars on the post-Soviet map. In Russia, the First Chechen War from 1994 to 1996 devastates Grozny and humiliates the Russian military. The second, launched in 1999 under a newly appointed prime minister named Vladimir Putin, becomes the vehicle for his ascent. By 2000, Putin is president, and the consolidation begins. Independent media curtailed, regional governors brought to heel, oligarchs forced into loyalty or exile. Rising oil prices fund a decade of stability and renewed national confidence. Victory Day parades on Red Square grow grander each May 9th, Soviet military marches echoing off the Kremlin walls as if the state that composed them never vanished. Yet the Soviet shadow stretches far beyond Russia's borders. In 2014, Russian forces seize Crimea and ignite war in eastern Ukraine's Donbass region, invoking historical bonds forged in Soviet-era unity. In 2022, a full-scale invasion shatters the post-Cold War European order entirely, sending millions of Ukrainians into exile and drawing battle lines across territories where Soviet collective farms once stretched to the horizon. The war exposes how deeply Soviet-era borders, identities, and grievances remain embedded in the present. Across the former Soviet space, contested memory defines public life. In Tallinn and Kiev, Soviet monuments come down. In Moscow and Minsk, they are polished and guarded. Abandoned gulag sites in Kolyma and Vorkuta decay into the permafrost, visited by small groups carrying photographs of grandparents who never returned. Nostalgia and trauma coexist in the same families, sometimes in the same sentence. Pride in victory over fascism, silence about the price extracted by the state that claimed that victory. The Soviet experiment raised literacy from darkness, launched humanity into orbit, and defeated the most destructive military machine in history. It also consumed millions of its own citizens in famine, terror, and forced labor, suppressed nations, crushed dissent, and ultimately collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. The question it poses remains unanswered and perhaps unanswerable, whether the vision of radical human equality can ever be pursued without becoming the instrument of its own betrayal. 15 flags fly where one once did, but the world the Soviet Union built and broke continues to shape every border, every alliance, and every argument about what states owe their people and what people owe the truth. Thank you for joining this journey through one of the most consequential stories in human history. If these episodes have deepened your understanding of the world we inherited, consider subscribing so you never miss what comes next.